and welcome to In the Feed Zone. My name is Jason Flores, and you can typically catch this live on Friday mornings on teamodz.com or Zwift Live by ODZ on Facebook. You can also check us out on your favorite podcast app. All you need to do is search for The Endurance Lab in your favorite podcast app. So, quick introductions here. Again, my name is Jason Flores, and welcome to In the Feed Zone. Quick medical disclaimer before we get started, that the only purpose of this live stream is to educate and to inform, and it's no substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified professional, and that it does not constitute medical or professional advice or services. The goals of the live stream today are to present current articles in the media covering food and hydration and how it relates to endurance sports, and also to open up a dialogue for viewers to ask questions and to get advice and to talk about their experiences with these topics. In the past couple of weeks, I've gotten a little bit of feedback of some of the articles that we've covered, and I was hoping to go back and cover a couple things that hopefully would give us a little bit more information. So I found a couple articles that may be helpful. Our article today is actually from Cycling Weekly. You could check them out at cyclingweekly.com. And it's going to be about fueling properly for winter cycling. I covered this a couple podcasts ago, but got a couple questions just to get a little bit more insight. So I found an article that would work well. We'll go ahead and go over kind of the top things that we'll be talking about today. We're going to be talking about things that we should consider, specifically considering our calories, the idea of a hydration station and what that means or what we should be thinking about. Thinking about carbohydrates and specifically their use during cold weather outings. The idea about warming it up, whether it be warming up on the bike or your food. What things you can do to bolster your immunity. You could actually go back a podcast or so, and we did talk about things to avoid getting sick. And also thinking ahead. So we'll go over these 6 topics, kind of take our time and have a little bit of a conversation here. I'll post a link to the full article in the live post here at Zwift Live by ODZ. So definitely check that out. And you can check the show notes and information there as well. So as we prepare for these colder rides, for some of our team members, they are full winter rides because of the temperature. It's not all about dressing properly, protecting our body, because cold conditions can present very unique challenges when it comes to a fueling perspective. It's a little bit different. So even if you don't live in a super cold place, for example, where we're at here in California, it can be definitely very moderate. We do have colder mornings, but it doesn't last most of the day, thank goodness. But some of our friends in the areas that it is cold, it can present kind of an all day, all ride consideration. So first thing to do is we wanted to touch on considering your calories. And essentially, you can estimate, there's different studies and calculators that says you should be taking in about 2-fold or twice the amount of calories during cold weather, just because the amount of calorie burn that you'll have during that session, whether it be wet, icy, or cold, the body is working harder to do the same sort of work as if it was warm. So it also does provide an additional resistance, thinking about pushing up against a headwind or rain, also the additional clothing, the ability to exchange, what we call like thermal regulation or the release of heat from the body into the environment, and just inefficiency as a whole during cold weather can all increase your calorie burn. So it's super important to make sure that we're taking that into consideration. It also, which is very important, and I find for myself as well as the athletes that I work with, is that it can also blunt your appetite, meaning that you may not feel as hungry when it's cold out. So it's very important to go out with a plan and have what you need accessible in order to achieve your goals. So obviously a failure to consume the calories, the protein, the carbohydrates, all of these things that we typically talk about kind of in a perfect situation can significantly impair your performance, your recovery, your immunity, all these things. And essentially make for a ride to be much more difficult than it should be. So the training volume and intensity can be reduced. We just need to take that into consideration on these sort of rides. So just be aware that changing your training sessions and knowing that during this time you may need to adjust. Great thing with the things that we do with the advent of Zwift and workouts from Trainer Road, looking at Training Peaks, and now looking at Sufferfest. All these things are options for when the weather gets really tough, and a lot of us already use some of these. So something to think about that. So as far as calories are concerned, making sure that you have a plan and also watching your intake. And we've had plenty of podcasts about how you can take a look and making sure you're getting the right things in. All right. So the next idea we wanted to touch on was what's called a hydration station. Well, really, it's not going to the gas station and hoping that they have everything you need. But during your training session, you need to make sure that you're maintaining adequate fluid intake, meaning that you're getting the hydration in, you're getting water and a good mix of carbohydrate and water in there for optimum absorption into the body. We've talked a little bit about that, making sure that you are focusing primarily from your bottles, hydration, and then getting fuel otherwise. Oppositely, on days where you may not be able to reach your bottle and the weather is very, very difficult, you may switch that over to get more carbohydrates into your bottle as well. And so that is a consideration during these cold times. So like in warm temperatures, it's very easy. You get prompts to drink. You feel like, oh, I do feel thirsty. When you are cold and the body is fighting to stay warm, a lot of times you'll find that you don't feel thirsty and you don't feel hungry. And even though that you are sweating, the body doesn't recognize this a lot of times, and it can be difficult because the body temperature is being held in with all the clothes, let's say, if we are all dressed properly. So the risk of dehydration definitely increases during this time. There was a study that they brought up that hydration levels of performing athletes in cold versus warm weather sports, that the cold weather teams had reported the highest incidence of dehydration, meaning that they came back from their training rides or races more dehydrated when they just had voluntary fluid intake. Essentially, they were drinking to thirst, that they were drinking less and coming back more dehydrated from colder weather sports versus warmer weather sports. So a conscious decision definitely needs to be made if you are looking for your highest level of performance during these sort of weather conditions. There was also another study that we're talking about that voluntary fluid intake to dry in these winter sport athletes were blamed on the belief that the sweat loss was less or insignificant. But in fact, if you are working at that higher level, it wasn't just a reduction to the drive to drink, but also exercising in cold condition actually increases the water loss via aspiration, that's you breathing out, as well as the body is forced to warm the body and humidify the cold air. So it's actually working a bit more than it would on a warm day, for example. So the last thing being that there's a constriction of the blood vessels. So the blood's not able to flow as easily as it would during warm weather for these same cold weather athletes. So the fluid circulating in the body and the organs was actually a little bit less, as well as your urine output. And all of these things are need to be taken into consideration. So in fact, it's not that the body's not working that hard. So the sweat losses do tend to be lower in the winter. You are still at risk of a dehydration due to reduced fluid intake and water loss. So dehydration, of course, we all know can affect performance, but so maintaining an adequate intake of fluid during cold weather rides should be a key priority, especially in this weather condition. So with this in mind, what we want to do is start our training sessions well hydrated. Of course, with any training session, we want to do that. So you want to drink early on your ride and kind of get an idea every 15, 20 minutes, for example, set some sort of an alarm or idea. Hey, this is what we're going to do to stay on track and can be very helpful. Typically, we use the 1 bottle an hour. We should try to keep that in the cold weather as well, if not just a little bit more. So one way you could find out how much water loss you're having during a typical session to kind of set a baseline, we've talked about this before, is you weigh yourself before with minimal clothing, and then you jump on for a trainer ride of a certain time, let's say usually an hour. You jump off, you weigh yourself again, you have an idea of how much weight you've lost. You can convert that to how much water that is, and you'll get at least a baseline amount of how much you should be drinking per hour. The other idea is that warmer fluids may be tolerated a little bit better when exercising in the cold. And so when I looked into this, or when I asked riders kind of how they feel about this, really, it's not talking about bringing like your hot chocolate or your hot coffee in your bottles. It's actually just getting it to be a good amount of degrees below the ambient temperature. So for example, if the temperature was 30 degrees outside, if you could use a bottle that's either wrapped up or one of those insulated bottles to keep the water just at what would normally be room temperature. Let's say if it was 30, like 60 degrees, let's say, it would actually be a little bit more soothing to the body, and could be easily increase your motivation to drink. So again, starting or trying an insulated bottle that we would normally use kind of in the warmer months to be able to keep your drink a little bit warmer, not say hot, but warmer than the ambient temperature could be useful, or maybe wrapping a bottle in some type of protective sock could be also useful so that it doesn't get too cold. And what you'll find, or at least stories that I've heard from athletes, is that bottles can actually sort of freeze and be very, very cold because of the wind passing by and then the condensation that happens on the outside of the bottle. So moving on to our next point, we're going to talk about carbohydrates and their role. So as with hydration, we were talking about making sure that you're staying hydrated during these sessions outdoors. For carbohydrates is also consideration that we need to take. Obviously, we know that is a preferred energy source, especially when doing high energy or high aerobic efforts. The fueling is during all endurance exercises. And we know that they also have limited capacity in our bodies. So it becomes very, very important, because the body is actually not only to do your training session and to turn the pedals in our case, but if in fact it is cold enough that the body is feeling it, your body's shivering and your muscles are trying to warm the body itself, even without moving. So even looking at studies, far back, they were looking at groups of men who were shivering for 2 hours, and they discovered there was a 7-fold increase in their carbohydrate use compared to those that were just looking at their oxidation or their use of fat. So their bodies actually had switched to using a carbohydrate source in order to just stay warm because of the conditions that they were in. So I guess looking at kind of the big picture of all this, it starts tapping into your muscle glycogen very, very early because of the temperature and because your body is in almost like fight or flight response, trying to survive if in fact it's that cold. So looking at that demand in conjunction with the demand that we normally have with longer rides, the risk of glycogen depletion, or essentially bonking or running out or not having enough carbohydrates on board, can definitely be of warrant, of something we need to look out for. So this definitely can lead to dips in performance, getting fatigued very early on, also with the risk of injury, which we don't want. It's the problems don't only lay in early fatigue, but if we do get down to glycogen depletion, it could also make you more cold. Essentially, your body will start moving those sources and not allowing your body to essentially keep the body temperature proper. And so you'll head to exhaustion very, very quickly. So to avoid this, we essentially need to make a plan, like we've talked about before. Of course, before and during, we can separate that into a couple sections. The first being before, you can have a meal containing very slow releasing carbohydrates 2 or 3 hours before a session, always recommended. Things like a hot bowl of porridge or oats, baked fruits, things that are just kind of warm, baked potatoes, things like that. These are all things that we just normally would fuel. So if you wouldn't normally fuel on, let's say, a 1 or 2 hour ride, you may want to kind of treat it as if it were a longer ride, and to get that fueling into the body to make sure that it has it on board. 30 to 60 minutes before, we're looking for something kind of a carbohydrate-rich snack. You're looking at something like a banana or raisins or something like that, just to boost the blood glucose. In this same category, you can do fuels like a bar, or even a gel if you do well with those. And then refueling rides up to 60 minutes. And in those intervals is something that we need to kind of just take into consideration. You may need to add a little bit more than you normally would, even for that 60-minute workout. And of course, rides over an hour, you're looking at anywhere from 30 to 60 grams. This is our typical consideration that we have to our riders. And it's just recommended to maintain blood glucose levels, and even more important during those times where it is super cold out. So as with any fluids, we've talked about that. It needs to be easy to open and to eat without needing to remove your gloves. If in fact you have long fingered gloves, or even kind of a more substantial glove, it needs to be easy to be able to eat. Wrappers need to be cut open so it's easy to slide out and that sort of thing. So easy to eat foods like bananas, fig rolls, trail mix, oat and fruit-based energy bars. So just if you are, remember, if you are looking or opting for a gel, you just need to make sure that you need to take fluid intake into the equation as well. You'll need to take both, obviously. And then, of course, post-workout, a meal or snack containing carbohydrates and protein, kind of normal recommendations. So the main thing during all of this is making sure that you fuel just that little bit more. If you are going out for 1 or 2 hour rides, keep in mind, think about maybe if you were fueling for a 2 to 3 hour ride. That way you have fuel on board beforehand, as well as you are fueling yourself during, and making sure that those choices that you have are easy to obtain, meaning that you can reach out to them and actually eat them and get to them. So we'll jump forward. We're about halfway through here. We're going to talk about warming it up. So essentially, consuming cold foods in cold weather just doesn't sound right. But a lot of the foods that we do use, the prepared foods that we have, bars and gels and things like that, are cold and will in fact get colder as we carry them during our rides. And so the motivation to eat or drink those could be very, very low. And they could also contribute to a dip in your body temperature because you're consuming cold foods. So from a practical standpoint, icy drinks and semi-frozen sports bars aren't the most appetizing things on your list. So to avoid this, see if you can look for more warm foods before, and of course, your rides, and during, and even after your training. Like we mentioned before, using insulated containers if needed. Sporn streaks, like we talked about, could be warmed for the sessions on the bike. And as a recovery, looking at a thermos of hot chocolate or something like that for afterwards, just to kind of warm the body afterwards. So when it comes again back to post-workout meals, hot, healthy dishes, again, to warm yourself from the inside out, things like warm oatmeal, hearty soups, chilies, rice, things like that. And winter stews with baked potato. These can all help in the recovery process and are kind of on the warm side. I guess on the opposite of that, we could normally at least actually look into more cold options, which would be like smoothies and things like that, recovery drinks. So looking at that, you may want to opt for some of these, kind of whole food choices. I think it would be very, very wise. So kind of wrapping that up, just making sure that you are opting for warmer foods if you can. It's tough, of course, to bring warm foods on the bike. So making the choices, towards actual foods versus like a cold, ice cold gel or drink or something like that could be useful. So next up, we've got bolstering your immunity. And flu season during this time, especially when the weather is cold, a lot of us are all pent up inside. And typically that is what's found in the studies is what is causing us to get sick, is because we are just inside around people that we're not getting out and getting fresh air, and the air inside our houses and places on offices and things like that are not getting recycled into fresh air. So it's really important during this time that we are taking consideration about our immune system. And we need to make sure that when we do have intense training, that it can significantly increase the risk of illness and definitely some interruptions to this training. So this idea of increase of upper respiratory tract infections, especially affecting the nose, the mouth, and kind of even in the throat, are all increased during the winter months, during the fact that during the cold, that the dry air favors the survival of these type of viruses as well. And being all pent up in our offices and our homes can definitely play a role in this. So some of kind of the things that we brought from our podcast about avoiding getting sick was making sure that you're washing your hands, avoiding the spread of these germs, making sure you're having a well-balanced, nutritious diet to kind of make sure your body has all the fuel that it needs, including brightly covered antioxidant, fruits, vegetables, fatty acids like fatty fish, walnuts, omega-3. We've got a whole podcast about that just a couple weeks back. So these immune boosting ingredients like coconut oil, garlic, chili, ginger. We also covered a couple spices that can definitely help during boosting your immune system. And of course, a healthy balance of your gut bacteria is also vital, with research showing that daily probiotic can boost immunity as well as gut health. So just some really good things. So as far as supplements to kind of look at, we did talk about a probiotic. Consuming that daily could be very, very useful. Something like vitamin D, especially in the winter, because you may not be getting exposure to the sun. It's very, very important because as a majority of our stores are activated by sunlight and exposure to the skin, you are more covered up. You're not getting exposed to the sun as much in the winter months. You can get onto a lower level, and this can lead to a greater risk of colds and flus. So looking at dietary sources like fatty fish, eggs, and butter, as well as a supplementation, could be very, very useful. And also, if in fact you are getting or feeling kind of under the weather, increase or doing a mega dose of vitamin C, anywhere from 1,000 even up to 4,000 milligrams is thought to be effective. And there are some foods, including peppers, dark green leafy vegetables, kiwis, and oranges that are actually pretty high in vitamin C, as well as powders and chewables that can be very, very useful to supplement that. And then above all, we've talked about this before as well, that lack of sleep and high stress can also influence immune function. So it's important to establish a good sleep habit, as well as things that we've talked about in the podcast before, as far as the balance between sleep and nutrition, with sleeping at night, turning off electronic devices, and the effect of alcohol on our sleep as well as our performance. As we round out here on our last point is to think ahead, to plan, perform, and prepare. So it's kind of the over kind of stand we have for the whole conversation today. And it's so essentially to fuel effectively, you need to think ahead and you need to prepare. You don't want to leave things to chance. You want to make sure that you have what you need. Nobody wants to end up middle of the ride or super hungry or and not having enough food, or find out that your bottle is half frozen because of you riding the last hour and a half or something like that. So one tip that we did have was that bringing a half full bottle or an empty bottle to be able to fill up halfway through at a water stop could be very, very useful too. So those are some things to take into consideration. So just consider the length of the ride and those pit stops and the availability of food to get, that would be warmer than what you're carrying in your pocket. And if you can heat something up or purchase something that's warm, that could be to your advantage. So kind of keep that in mind as you're out on your training rides and with your group. At the same time, for the pre and post workout times, you want to cook hot foods in bulk so you have that available, that's soups and stews and things like that, and make sure that fluid and food are available for right after during the recovery period, whether it's work or home or somewhere else. We just need to find that so that the convenience of heating food isn't an issue, because you want to keep refuel yourself with warm food if you can. So having that available, those oats and porridge or soups, whatever you're going to be having after, could be useful. Just preparing. So just remember that all these conditions, if you're cold, whether it be cold, icy, rainy, these all can be really hazardous. Obviously, it's very bravado to make it out during those times. You should definitely carry some emergency rations, meaning a little extra food always, whether it be for yourself or one of your fellow ride mates, just in case something were to happen and you end up being outside more than you're anticipating. So having extra food can be definitely very, very useful. So as a quick summary, we talked a little bit about fueling properly for winter cycling. This is our second podcast about that, delving a little further into the conversation. We talked about needing to consider the amount of calories that you're putting in and thinking that the body is actually using more calories than it normally would. making sure that you have an idea of what hydration you're going to be having, planning all of that, and making sure on the carbohydrate side that you're fueling as well, that you're making sure that you have those opportunities and fueling just that little bit more than you normally would. We talked about warming things up, whether it be the food or the hydration that you're bringing, or stopping along the way to get something kind of room temperature. And it doesn't need to be hot warm, it just needs to be warmer than it is outside. We did talk about a couple of tips about how to bolster your immunity, and that you need to think ahead, and kind of the overwhelming topic here is to plan, to prepare in order to be able to perform. So really great article by Cycling Weekly, and they've got a couple that I've pulled out for the coming weeks. So I look forward to be able to present those to you. I'll go ahead and put a link to the full article here in the live stream, but and I'll also post that in the show notes. But you can go to cyclingweekly.com/news. They've got some really great articles, not only about cycling news, but nutrition and everything else, but they've got a good basis of information there. So for me, looking into these things, definitely really interesting topic. And if you have a topic that you'd like to hear in the feed zone, definitely send it through, leave it in the comments here, and I will take a look at that. With that, I want to say thank you for joining us today. It was a little bit of a longer presentation today, and I thank you. And I want you guys to, if you get a chance, to head to the Facebook group, search for Zwift Live by ODZ. If you're watching this live, click that like button, share it with a friend, or head to your favorite podcast app and search for The Endurance Lab. Lastly, we do have a YouTube channel. Definitely check that out as well. All you need to do is search Team ODZ or The Endurance Lab and click that subscribe button. And what's the worst that you can do that could happen is you hear me, Justin, and Taya, and all the rest of the Team ODZ group in your podcast app or in your YouTube channel every week. We've got content every week, so definitely check that out. All right, so with that, I want to be signing off, and I will see everybody next week in the feed zone.